Hello and welcome to Chess Goblin. In this video, I will show you a game that was played between Nojabek and Magnus Carlsen. This game was played on the fourth day of the Grand Chess Tour happening in Poland. This game is a 5-minute game with a 5-second increment per move. Magnus has the white pieces and Nojabek has the black pieces. And it starts off with e4 and then Nojabek plays d5, initiating the Scandinavian defense. The Scandinavian defense is pretty rare at high-level chess, especially at classic level, especially at like long version chess. It is very rare to see, but under these blitz game conditions, we can see a lot more unusual and exciting openings. So it happens with the Scandinavian defense, and Magnus captures, and Nojabek captures back with his queen. Magnus develops his knight, very principled, and Nojabek steps his queen back one spot. And then we see just regular development of the knights. Then Magnus hops his knight out to b5, targeting the queen and also hitting this pawn on c7, trying to get a fork kind of with the king and the rook, but it is easily defended when Nojabek protects it with his queen. Magnus plays this bishop move up here. The idea of this move is to open up to the line so he can castle. What Stockfish would recommend in this move, instead of playing this bishop up, is to instead push this pawn to try to kick back the knight from c6. And white or black cannot really capture back with their knight because you can actually sacrifice your queen as white, and if black takes back, then you have this royal fork hitting the king, the rook, and the queen. So instead, Magnus pushes his bishop up with the idea of castling. And Nojabek kicks back his knight, and there's two places white can go here. They can put their knight on a3 or c3. And Magnus plays the better one to a3. And the reason why a3 is better than c3, because if you move to c3 instead, the knight is a lot harder to develop and push from this position, since the squares that you would want to develop it later in the game are all covered by black. But if we put the knight on a3, these future squares, with the future idea of moving here, this is kind of the idea that white wants to do, and then to develop their knight over here, rerouting it in a lot easier way. So Magnus obviously plays the best move, and then Nojabek develops his bishop. Magnus plays the knight over here like we thought he was going to, with the idea of putting him on one of these squares future in the game. And Nojabek opens up this pawn right here with the idea of bringing his bishop out to be able to castle. Magnus castles, and then black pushes their bishop up to future castle later. Magnus now connecting all his pawns, and Nojabek castles. Very equal right here. Both people have castled, and they've got fair development of both colors. And then Magnus kicks back the bishop, very principled. And after he pushes back the bishop, Magnus develops his bishop. Then Nojabek reroutes his knight to try to hit Magnus's bishop to push it back to g3. And then Nojabek is attacking on the queen's side. And Magnus is forced to kick back his pieces. He's losing the initiative here as Nojabek is gaining space on the queen side and the king side. And he's pushing back his bishop. Magnus is now trying to hit the bishop and protect his bishop over here. And after we see a trade of bishops, Magnus's space is really compact compared to Nojabek's here. And as we see, as a couple moves go later down the game, Magnus is trying to kick back Nojabek, but ends up just getting pushed back. Now, if we see here, Magnus has 4 pieces just sitting on the back row doing nothing, and his knights right here are in a compromised position, as opposed to Nojabek, who has both of his knights further developed, his queen and bishop better placed. And then he moves his rook over. Stockfish doesn't really like this. Stockfish would prefer just to like move, slowly develop the queen around and the rooks, but this is not very bad. It's slight inaccuracy, but Nozhebek is just trying to pile the pieces down the D file, targeting this pawn here, and Magnus pushes his knight up to try to hit this queen, but Nozhebek just trades off the knight right away. After we receive trade of pieces, Magnus now trying to kick Nozhebek's knight back. He kicks the knight back, and now Magnus is slowly gaining the space and gaining back the tempo and the good positioning that he did not have earlier. He recaptures the pawn. Nozhebek moves his queen. Magnus pushing the pawn, and then we see a rook trade here. Materially, it's equal, and positionally, it's very equal for both people. Their kings are both very safe, and pieces evenly developed. And then we see this move of a fork here. This is not a great fork, but it is a fork at this high level, but Magnus finds the move where he hits Nozhebek's rook in the corner, and so Nozhebek has to move his rook, and it's not really a fork here. Magnus moves his rook, and Nozhebek picks up another free pawn here. Magnus trying to pin it, but it's very solid here. They're both finding great moves, and now Magnus is trying to expand a little bit on the king side. Nozhebek trying to reroute his knight to get it more into the action here. And then Magnus has this inaccurate move here. Stockfish prefers instead to try to like bring your bishop up to bring it into the action, since it's not doing a ton back here in f1, but it's Magnus, so we can't really argue. And then Nozhebek finds the move, bringing his knight over, which forces Magnus to move. And right here, Nozhebek is in a lot better position, but he blunders here. And the reason why this is a blunder is because if Magnus moves here, the queen trade is bad, because then after you recapture the pawn, this passing pawn is going to be very, very difficult to stop. So they can't really trade queens there, and instead Nozhebek moves his queen over to try to attack Magnus's knight. But then Magnus gets into the back, and then Nozhebek loses a pawn. The pawn that he gained earlier, Magnus has got back. Nozhebek tries to bring the queen around, and then Magnus is sealing off Nozhebek's king. Now he can't escape this corner, and Nozhebek finds the move to try to break open this entrapment that Magnus is getting him into. After a trade of pawns, Magnus now puts him in a double check with the queen and the knight. Nozhebek's king looks very exposed in this position, and Magnus is, if you look at the eval bar, 6.7 ahead. He's way ahead here. If you look at both of their clocks, they're both down to 12 seconds. And there is a 5-second increment, but they are moving extremely quickly here, so they don't run out of time. Nozhebek moves his king to try to attack this knight, and Magnus protects it. Nozhebek tries to block it, and then Magnus pulls it away. Nozhebek's king just doing a little dance here, trying to not get checkmated, and then loses another pawn. Then Nozhebek does this ditch effort to try to break open the king's position. And then he just hops his knight back, and then Nozhebek trades the last knight here. Magnus is 8.6 better according to Stockfish. Clearly winning. At this level of chess, it is extremely hard to get that back. He has 2 knights hanging here. And now his king's being kicked to the back. And now, in this position, Magnus wants to take this knight. That's what he should do. He should take this knight, forcing Nozhebek to move his king, and then he takes up back a second knight and then he'll be a whole knight up going into the endgame, and black is in extreme trouble going against Magnus, a knight back in the endgame. It would be terrible. But instead, Magnus checks the king, not the move he was supposed to find, and then he moves his king over. And now here, Magnus has to find moving his queen over, because after Nojabek moves his king, he can still pick up the knight. That's what he has to find here. But instead, he hangs his queen in one. Magnus hung his queen in one, walked right into a pen against the queen, and Magnus just resigned on the spot. Magnus was completely winning. It was a completely winning game. And then he just hung his queen. Considered the best chess player ever. Just hung his queen and won. Magnus doesn't have a ton of games left going into the tournament. And after this game, he was 2.5 behind the leader, Wei Yi, Grandmaster from China. But over the next day, heading into the last day, he was 2.5 points behind. And the last 2 games of the day, Magnus was able to draw. And the 10 before that, he won all 10, beating everybody else in the competition, winning 10 straight games in a row. And if we look at the standings, Magnus was able to pull out a lead, beating Wei Yi by half a point. Magnus beat every other Grandmaster on the list in a row and was managed to win this tournament. This was just a strange game that Magnus played against Nojabek and managed to lose his queen. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit that like button down below and subscribe if you have not already done before. It really helps. I hope to see you in the next video.